May I ask the
Yeah.
first question?
Yeah.
So I think I was at least inspired to, okay, so I'm going to start some changes now. And I imagine people in the audience as well. What sort of I mean, even if you work in a company or a public organization, what's sort of a good way to start your journey to maybe resource other organizations than you currently are? Or, yeah, what's some first steps that you can recommend me and others to take?
You mean to get involved in work that's about trying to change systems or
Yes.
help things transition?
Or maybe change things where you are to either help the thing you're in die, or, as you say, make sure that there's resources for the alternatives that we need.
A first thing, I mean, I don't think this is a very profound answer, but I mean, I think a first thing would be to have a conversation with whoever you're working with about, like, are we actually facing up to what is going on in the world? So that, I think, is a really big challenge in this work, and it comes up a lot where, and that's hard because lots of us don't want to face what's happening and the complexity and the scale. But I think if we don't have the conversations that acknowledge that, then we can't really meaningfully get involved in trying to do anything about it. And then I guess there's like a kind of acknowledgement or recognition of like what's going on in the wider world and having a conversation about that. And then, so what's in our little microcosm, in our organization or in our home or in our community or in our friendship, or, what does that mean for us? And like, what does that require of us at this time? What can we do? What do we need to change? What could we stop doing? What should we do more of? I think on the Stewarding Loss website, where we've developed quite a few tools, we have, I think, I'm obviously a bit biased, but we do have some useful questions and canvases, I think, to try and have those sort of conversations, especially from an organisational perspective. Like, are we still relevant? Are we still needed in this system and at this time? Are we still staying true to our purpose? And it's those kind of questions. But I guess I think I said about friendship, or I guess that I love Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote a brilliant book called Emergent Strategy. She talks about fractals, and I guess and a fractal is at every scale it has an integrity to it. It has a particular pattern that kind of scales up, and I guess that's why I think even in your one-to-one relationships, in how you treat the living world, in the kind of every act and way of being in relationship with others is a way of starting to do something differently, potentially.
So we have a microphone. Hildred has a microphone. I see one hand, I see two hands. Keep the hands coming. And do you want to start here, Hildred? Gentleman on the second row.
Hello.
And please say who you are and at least your name would be nice.
Yes, hi, I'm Jonathan. And I wanted to ask if you ever used the model that you showed where the emergent might actually be an unwanted emergent and the existing is something worth defending. When I saw it, I thought liberal democracy and populism. And you can think about who has been working to make that emergent system, who's trying, all those little actors could also be flipped. And I wonder if you ever use that as a way to think this is how we might defend and protect something worth keeping.
I think that's a really good point. And I think people do, but that isn't the work I tend to get involved in, because I actually think there's really different energy involved in protecting and defending versus creating and building, and we need it all. But I'm spending my time at the moment investing in the people that are building the new. But I think that model, yeah, you can use it in lots of different ways and lots of different scales. You could use it on a theme, like a sector, on a set of values and beliefs that are dying, and yeah. I'm going all the way back here.
Hi, my name is Christian. Thank you for the talk, and thank you for the first question, because I think I have one that goes a little bit in a similar vein, which you talked a lot about the pioneers and the people trying to birth the new systems, which is what you work with. And I really like the quote that you put in the beginning, and I want to add another quote that I'm sure a lot of you have heard by Antonio Gramsci, who said, the old world is slowly dying, the new world is struggling to be born, this is a time of monsters. And when he's asking how do you use your system to defend things that are worth defending, I'm wondering, how do you deal with the people that are actively trying to keep the old world in place? How do you deal with the monsters?
I mean, I call that face because there's a lot of them around. This is not plain sailing, easy work. Even amongst fellow people working in philanthropy, there are monsters. Although I feel that's a bit unkind. Anyway, I mean, I actually think one of the most effective ways I have found at dealing with monsters, that's why maybe I love the energy of building the new, because I think often when you can actually show something else being possible, it can actually diffuse the monster energy more quickly than anything else. Like often people don't believe that something else is possible. So often the monster energy, if we call it an energy, tends to be actually rooted in fear, and a belief that like this is just how things are. Or they have, I guess, another monster energy is they're very invested in the current system because they're really benefiting from it. But I think that I think with wealth holders that don't want to that want to continue accumulating their own wealth excessively, I think like some of the ways in which we can see that having the potential to shift is because the younger generation, often their children, are like, "What do you mean that you don't care about the climate crisis?" So it's like when a new energy enters the system, and that starts to build, and also because I think a lot of them are starting to have more and more fear about kind of civil unrest and the growing inequality and what that has the potential to lead to. But I think the people where the energy is more, the monster is more about fear and kind of disbelief, that's where the propositional work, taking people to see and feel and experience a different alternative, it does really shift something in them. Well, that's been our experience. I'm not saying we're going to sort out all the monsters.
Third row. All the way to the other side. Sorry, Hillary.
Thanks. My name is Alexander Crawford. I have a question around money and funding. I guess there's one school of thought that looks at money as neutral energy, just like the sun or something. And then there's another school of thought that looks at money as, I don't know, fertilizer, nutrients, where it's sometimes good, but it's sometimes poisonous and sometimes dangerous. So going back to the first quote, where does money fit into the composting in the ruins? And in philanthropy, how does one make sure that the philanthropic capital is actually making good ruins?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that I would say that's present in everything I do these days, because I think in the philanthropy world in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot of, there's been a couple of books written, like Edgar Villener's book on decolonizing capital. I don't think that's what it's called. Winner Takes All, which was another book that, there's been some books that have really, honed in on all the reasons why philanthropy is like not a good thing in the world. And, the guy that runs the Ford Foundation says philanthropy is not justice. And then since George Floyd's murder in 2020, in May 2020, and the kind of racial justice reckoning, that also brought a whole other, I mean, I don't know how that was experienced here, but certainly in the UK, because UK philanthropy is very, very influenced by US philanthropy, the racial reckoning, the sort of Black Lives Matter uprising, that put another like very heated gaze on philanthropy. Where is philanthropic money from? Who's been extracted from? Like, who does that wealth actually belong to? Which is why there is a growing movement around reparations. So a Rising Quo, the wealth holder I work with there, a lot of the work we're now doing is looking at reparations to the Democratic Republic of Congo, because that's the origin of some of his wealth. So I think that those conversations are sort of, I mean, there's a long way to go, but there's a lot. I'm not really, every week, I would say I'm in some meeting or workshop that is related to those kind of questions. But I think a bigger question that sits around a lot of this work that we're doing is, that's why I also really like the frame of transition, because I feel like potentially, and actually you could say we wish for, at some point, capital, like wealth that is financial wealth, won't have the same value anymore anyway. It will become worthless, because hopefully we are living in a different kind of economic paradigm where it becomes meaningless. Like, we value care, we value, like all the things that you would hope we did value now. So that's kind of why we talk about that, we sort of acknowledge we're doing this work in in late stage capitalism, not post, in late stage capitalism. So what does that mean? And that's kind of why we have a particular focus and feel there's a particular sort of urgency in a way to make, how can we make sure then, if we're in this late stage capitalism, that wealth is actually put to use in a very particular way.
Thank you, Cassie. Very inspiring. I have so many questions. And funnily enough, I spent the day today, I worked with a project in Berlin, and I interviewed 60, 70-year-old people in Germany for their financial planning and looking into how the great wealth transfer could maybe support the climate financing gap and similar initiatives. So I would be very, very curious to hear any specific experiences from your side on that one. I didn't make it through the whole supply and demand slide that you had up there. But yeah, what projects, what initiatives, what experiences in that field you have gathered?
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly, I should also say, like, I'm quite new to some of the wealth stuff. Like, I guess I've been working more in philanthropy, and then in the last few years, I'm working more in the sort of wider system of wealth. So I'm learning a lot about it myself. But I guess some of the things that I am particularly inspired by, or think there's real opportunity. So there's this whole thing that in the UK is, we call it like the wealth defence industry, which is all these kind of professions that are there to try and protect wealth holders to have greater wealth and to avoid their taxes and to invest in a particular way. And like that, it sort of blew my mind when I was first like learning more and more about all the different types of people and professions that are set up to do that. And I guess what's inspiring is that there are, like there's a next generation of wealth holders who are saying to their parents, like, this is disgusting, like how much wealth we have and how are we redistributing it and how have we ever thought that it's ours anyway. There is a group of wealth advisors, so the people that sit and advise wealthy people not to pay their taxes, who are also like, hang on, we're being trained to give wealth advice that fundamentally needs to be turned on its head. So there's a progressive wealth advice movement that's being grown in the UK by an organisation called Good Ancestor Movement. So like they're one of the organisations that we fund. And I think that's really exciting that like there is this momentum. Some of the other things that we're funding in that space is actually this idea of a extreme wealth line. At the moment, it's just almost a piece of research, but we have an extreme poverty line in the UK, and you know we talk about extreme poverty, but we don't really talk about extreme wealth. And I think some of the scales of wealth that some people hold now are kind of unfathomable. I can't remember. Like, you know, but they're so enormous. I don't think they're almost mythic. But like, so I think if we create an extreme wealth line, how can we use that in relation to the extreme poverty line and kind of tell the story of how they're totally related? And actually doing some work with around public perception of wealth and wealth accumulation, like what is enough. And I guess that's where I find, you know, there's a growing movement in Europe around it's called the Beyond Growth. There was a Beyond Growth Summit in Brussels earlier this year. And I feel like, you know, that was really impressive that someone from the European Commission was kind of heading that up, or like at least was an ally to it. And that is a growing movement. I mean, it's still tiny, but it is growing. But yeah, so I think there's some really interesting stuff to do around the psychology of wealth as well. And there's been some really interesting studies recently there's an anthropologist at Oxford University called Bridget Kustner, and she's been studying like wealth holders, and a linguist who's been doing some work around like the language of wealth. So there's actually quite a lot of work starting to happen that I think is really interesting.
Second row. I saw your hand before, at least. Is it still valid, the question? Yeah, good.
Hi, my name is Martine, and I've got a question, and that is, how do we deal with the grief and the loss and the climate anxiety and all these like really heavy feelings, and how do we get, it's like big talking, but how do we get humanity to the stage where we are capable of seeing the world in a more diverse way and having multiple worldviews, more neuroplasticity, human imagination, all that, and really get hope? How do we get that to the masses? Because I kind of feel that these conversations are so important, but they're still in these very small communities and they're very limited. And for most people, this is just space talk, really. So how do we, I mean, I don't want to sound like startup business, but how do we scale this?
I don't know if I have the answers to that, but I can say a few. I mean, I think, you know, I think what's happening at the moment in Gaza and Israel and Palestine, and obviously that's not the only place where there is war and genocide happening, but that, like how that has, and obviously it's different in different places because I also have lots of people that are kind of carrying on as business as usual, but other spaces that I'm in are not, and then they're not turning away from that. And I have really seen how the grief of that is really opening up people in a different way. So I actually think grief is one of the ways, like the pain of the world, and grief is a way into a different way of being together. And like I've been like so grateful and inspired by people in the last sort of 8 weeks that have been holding spaces for grief. You know, and obviously most of us are very lucky to be probably safe, but to be in spaces where you can still go with your pain and have like broken hearts together because of what you're not turning away from and what you're showing up for. Yeah, I think those spaces have something very different in them in terms of their tone. That have like, yeah. So I'm quite interested. Like, I'm wondering what will happen with some of those spaces, and how they'll continue. And then I guess some of the like other experiments I've known of that are maybe trying to answer your question, but I don't think they've cracked it. But that doesn't mean they won't, because I guess some of this stuff can take a long time. There's an organisation in the UK called Larger Us, and they looked at like the Alcoholics Anonymous, like the AA model of like those kinds of groups as a way of scaling. Like the Larger Us were trying to bring together, I guess, people that wouldn't normally, you know, like the growing polarization, and how do we hold spaces where people can come together and talk and be in conversation and feel differently and be differently together. And I think there's some interesting things in what they're trying to do. And there's another one in the US, I can't remember their name. Anyway, I think that they're trying to sort of, it's almost like those small parts loosely joined, smaller groups that have a narrative that's shared, so they feel like they're part of something bigger, but they're actually quite local or contextual. I don't know if that makes sense.
Like elephant. Suddenly.
It's not, but I do know of them as well. Yeah.
So 2 more questions. One here and then one last one.
I'm really curious to hear an example from your stewarding loss slide, you know, type of an organization that is in one of those states. Can you share a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's actually loads of organisations that are in the denial state. I mean, in UK civil society, I feel like 1/3 of all charities should probably die. And that's because it's become such a professionalised sector, and they almost, they're trying to continue to exist rather than recognise that maybe some are no longer needed. So some of the really big charities in the UK, I'm not going to name any particular ones, and some of them are doing amazing work, but I think some of the larger charities have grown so big that it's almost like they need money to just stay big charities rather than deliver on their mission. And actually, because I think there's so much we know now about how, like, people's needs around mental health, for example, are very context specific, or like place specific. So can a big national charity actually is that the right model still for some of those kinds of services? And I think there are some big charities that are playing a really useful role as a kind of infrastructure, because they have a generosity of spirit, but that's not the case of some of the others. But I mean, you know, we have supported some organisations to die, where, yeah, actually an infrastructure body called the Small Charities Coalition in the UK, that had lots of members that were small charities, and they just couldn't survive. And I think the thing that was very difficult about that is that they came to us when they only had maybe 2 months still to like exist, and that was a very quick death in a way, and that meant that you couldn't bring the care to it that you could if you actually had maybe a year to actually design for a good ending. And I think that's one of the things we're trying to encourage funders to do, is resource some of these endings so that the wisdom that does exist, the people whose jobs are going to be lost, like there's a care to it and an intention to it. But I'm really interested in how we can incentivize more organizations to die. And when in the first phase of stewarding loss, we actually held some like loss circles for organizations that thought they might be heading that way. And one of the things that I was most struck by that I hadn't been anticipating was there was actually a lot of anger towards the organizations that wouldn't die, because lots of people could see how they were holding on to resources and sucking up resources that was making it very difficult for anything new to emerge. Obviously, it really is important who gets to decide who dies. Like, that's not our role. Someone said to me the other day, like, how do you decide? And I was like, we don't. You know, like, that's not our role. But part of our role is creating an invitation that makes that an option for people, that doesn't feel like a failure, but actually feels like an act of courage.
And I've decided to ask the last question myself, and I want to ask the question to the audience. So I'm wondering how many of you feel that you're a part of something where there is either the whole thing or a part of the thing that you're a part of can die? So 10%, 90% of you are a part of things that, like, everything that we do is still valid and needs to exist in the future. Okay, so I ask the question again. How many of you are part of something where you feel like this could go? Okay, at least 50, 60%? And tomorrow we know that we can go back to our colleagues. I feel the same, by the way. And we can go back to our colleague and we can discuss what we will end, and maybe that's good soils for new starts.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming, Cassie.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you.